He wanted to divorce her, but what she did last night left him speechless. Hello, let's start another beautiful story. Welcome to my channel. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Let's go. The setting sun cast long shadows across Theodore Parker's mahogany desk, the golden light catching the edge of his wedding ring as he twisted it absently. 7 years of marriage reduced to a single document before him. The words, "Petition for Divorce," stark against the crisp white paper. From his corner office on the 42nd floor, Manhattan sprawled beneath him like a glittering chessboard, a game he'd mastered long ago. Each building represented another conquest, another deal closed, another step toward the empire he'd built. At 38, Theodore had everything he'd ever wanted, almost everything. His intercom buzzed, jarring him from his thoughts. "Mr. Parker, your wife is here." Theodore straightened his Italian silk tie, a gesture as mechanical as the smile he wore in board meetings. "Send her in, Claire." Grace entered like a whisper, her artistic soul evident in every detail, from her paint-stained fingers to the way she carried herself, as if she were walking through one of her own watercolor paintings. Her dark copper hair was pulled back in a loose bun, wisps framing a face that still held the softness that had once captivated him. "You wanted to see me, Theo." Her voice was steady, but he caught the slight tremor in her hands as she clutched her leather portfolio, her constant companion, filled with sketches and dreams he'd long stopped asking about. "Please, sit." He gestured to the leather chair across from his desk, maintaining the professional distance he'd perfected over the years. "I think we both know this has been coming." Grace's green eyes met his, and for a moment, Theodore felt an unfamiliar twinge in his chest. She didn't cry, didn't plead. Instead, she looked at him with an artist's perception, as if she were seeing layers he himself couldn't recognize. "But I suppose we do," she replied, her fingers tracing the edge of her portfolio. 7 years is a long time to pretend everything's fine." Theodore pushed the divorce papers across the desk, his movements precise and controlled. "I've had my lawyers draw up a generous settlement. You'll be well taken care of, Grace. I'm not unreasonable." A soft, sad laugh escaped her lips. "Reasonable. That's always been your way, hasn't it? Everything calculated, measured, profitable." She didn't touch the papers. Instead, she reached into her portfolio and pulled out a small, worn photograph. "Do you remember this place?" She slid the picture across his desk, bridging the gap between them. Theodore glanced down at the image, their old country house in the Berkshires, its weathered blue shutters and wrap-around porch bathed in autumn light. The place where he'd proposed, where they'd spent countless weekends in their early years, before board meetings and international calls had filled his calendar. "Grace, the past is—" "I'm not asking for a reconciliation," she interrupted, her voice stronger now. "But I am asking for one thing before we end this, one night in that house, just us, a proper goodbye to what we had." Theodore's instinct was to refuse. His time was valuable, scheduled down to the minute. Sentiment was inefficient, messy, yet something in Grace's expression, not desperate but determined, gave him pause. Why? Because someday, when all these towers you've built cast their shadows over everything else, you might want to remember that you were once capable of more than just reasonable decisions. She stood, smoothing her simple dress. "One night, Theodore, that's all I'm asking. After that, I'll sign whatever you want." The logical part of his brain, the part that had built his empire, screamed that this was unnecessary, inefficient. But as Grace turned to leave, Theodore found himself saying, "This weekend, I'll have Claire send you the details." She paused at the door, the setting sun turning her silhouette to flame. "Thank you." Then she was gone, leaving behind only the photograph and the lingering scent of her lavender perfume. Theodore stared at the picture, his finger unconsciously tracing the outline of the old house. In the bottom corner, barely visible, was Grace's artistic signature and a date. "Where Dreams Took Root, Summer 2016. He slipped the photo into his desk drawer, trying to ignore the strange emptiness that had settled in his chest. Outside his window, the city lights began to flicker on, one by one, like stars being born in an urban sky. But for the first time in years, Theodore Parker, master of Manhattan's concrete kingdom, felt oddly untethered in his carefully ordered world. The divorce papers lay forgotten on his desk, their shadows growing longer as darkness crept into the office. One last night, he thought. What could possibly change in one night? Theodore's Bentley purred along the winding roads of the Berkshires, each mile drawing him further from the familiar comfort of Manhattan's steel and glass canyons. The late afternoon sun filtered through autumn leaves, casting dappled shadows across the leather dashboard. His hands gripped the steering wheel too tightly, betraying the tension he refused to acknowledge. He'd almost cancelled twice. The first time was during a crucial merger meeting when his mind had inexplicably wandered to Grace's paint-stained fingers. The second was this morning, as he packed an overnight bag, an action so foreign it felt almost rebellious against his meticulously scheduled life. Both times, something had stopped him. Perhaps it was the memory of Grace's quiet determination in his office, or maybe the photograph that had mysteriously migrated from his desk drawer to his wallet. The GPS announced his arrival in 15 minutes. Its robotic voice, a poor substitute for the way Grace used to navigate these roads. She had always insisted on using paper maps, claiming they held stories that satellites couldn't tell. "Look, Theo," she'd say, tracing the blue veins of rivers with her finger. "These lines are like the artwork of time itself." He'd found it charming then. A flash of blue through the trees snapped him back to the present. The house's weathered shutters came into view, and Theodore felt an unexpected tightness in his throat. 7 years of neglect had left their mark. Ivy crept up the white clapboard siding like grasping fingers, and the garden Grace had so lovingly tended had grown wild, roses tangling with weeds in a chaotic dance. As he pulled into the gravel driveway, he spotted Grace's modest sedan, already parked beneath the old maple tree, their tree, where they'd spent countless summer evenings watching fireflies rise from the grass like wayward stars. He checked his watch, 4:47 p.m. Of course she'd arrived early. Grace had always lived life slightly ahead of schedule, eager for each moment before it arrived. Theodore sat in his car, engine off, listening to the tick of cooling metal. Through the windshield, he watched a cardinal land on the porch railing, a splash of crimson against weathered grey wood. Grace had once filled a whole sketchbook with drawings of the birds that visited their feeder, each page a testament to hours of patient observation. He'd called it a waste of time. The front door opened, and Grace stepped onto the porch. She'd changed from her city clothes into a simple sundress, her hair loose around her shoulders. The sight of her in this setting, so familiar yet so distant, made something shift uncomfortably in Theodore's chest. "I was beginning to think you might not come," she called out, her voice carrying across the autumn air with remarkable composure. Theodore emerged from the car, straightening his suit jacket automatically. "I said I would." He retrieved his overnight bag from the trunk, its sleek leather looking oddly out of place against the rustic backdrop. "You say a lot of things, Theo." The words held no bitterness, only a quiet observation that somehow made them harder to hear. As he climbed the porch steps, the wooden boards creaked beneath his Italian leather shoes, a sound so achingly familiar it nearly stopped him in his tracks. How many times had he rushed up these same steps, eager to share news of a successful deal with Grace? How many times had she waited here, sketchbook in hand, ready to show him her latest work? "I've started dinner," Grace said, stepping aside to let him enter. "I thought we could eat in the garden, like we used to." The scent hit him as soon as he crossed the threshold. Garlic, rosemary, and something else that made his carefully constructed walls waver. "You're making your grandmother's recipe," he said before he could stop himself. Grace's eyes met his, surprise flickering across her features. "You remember? Coq au vin. You made it the night we closed on the house." The memory rose unbidden. Grace in the kitchen, flour on her cheek, teaching him how to properly brown the mushrooms while classical music played from the old radio. It seemed fitting. she replied softly. "And for endings as well as beginnings." Theodore placed his bag at the foot of the stairs, suddenly unsure of his footing in this house full of ghosts. Every surface held a memory. The chip in the hallway wall from moving in their first furniture, the height marks penciled on the kitchen doorframe from their godson's visits, the worn spot on the banister where his hand had always rested as he called up to Grace in her studio. "I need to change," he said abruptly, needing to escape the weight of remembrance. Grace nodded, turning back toward the kitchen. "Take your time. The past isn't going anywhere." As Theodore climbed the stairs, each step felt heavier than the last. He'd come here to give Grace closure, to tie up loose ends with his usual efficiency. But standing in this house, breathing in the mingled scents of Grace's cooking and the lingering traces of oil paint from her old studio, he realized he might have miscalculated. For the first time in years, Theodore Parker felt something he couldn't quantify on a spreadsheet. Fear, not of Grace, or even of memories, but of what might happen when he finally allowed himself to really look at what he was so determined to leave behind. Theodore stood in the upstairs guest bathroom, staring at his reflection as he loosened his tie. He'd changed into what he considered casual, pressed khakis and a light blue button-down shirt, but somehow felt more out of place than ever. Through the open window, the sound of Grace humming floated up from the garden, an old melody he couldn't quite place. He splashed water on his face, trying to wash away the unsettling feeling that had been growing since his arrival. On the shelf above the sink, a forgotten tube of Grace's watercolor paint still sat, cerulean blue, her favorite. The cap was stuck on with dried paint, a testament to countless mornings when she'd rushed to capture the dawn light, leaving little pieces of her artistic life scattered throughout their home. Their home! No, he corrected himself. Just a house now. The garden had transformed in the fading light. Grace had cleared a small area among the wild roses, setting up their old wooden table with mismatched candles in mason jars. The sight struck him with its elegant simplicity, so different from the sterile perfection of his preferred restaurants in the city. "I found these in the cellar," Grace said as he approached, holding up a bottle of wine. "Remember when we used to talk about starting our own vineyard?" Theodore's chest tightened. It had been one of their shared dreams, back when they still had those. That was a long time ago. Not that long. Grace poured the wine into 2 glasses they'd bought at a local antique shop during their first summer here, though I suppose time moves differently for everyone. The coq au vin sat between them, its aroma mixing with the sweet perfume of late-blooming roses. Grace served him first, her movements graceful and unhurried. For a moment, neither spoke, the weight of countless unshared meals hanging between them. "The London merger," Grace said suddenly, breaking the silence. "That was when it started to change, wasn't it?" Theodore paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. "What do you mean?" "You know what I mean, Theo." She took a sip of wine, her eyes reflecting the candlelight. "That was when you stopped coming home for dinner. When your assistant started sending me birthday cards on your behalf." He wanted to defend himself, to cite the importance of that deal, the billions at stake. Instead, he found himself saying, "I didn't think you'd noticed." Grace's laugh was soft but held no joy. "I noticed everything. The way you stopped looking at my new paintings, how you'd check your phone during our conversations, the growing distance in your eyes when you'd kiss me goodbye, on the rare mornings you were still home when I woke up." "Grace, no, let me finish." She set down her glass, her fingers tracing the rim. "I kept thinking if I just loved you enough, if I could just be more understanding of your ambitions, you'd find your way back. But that's not how love works, is it? You can't love someone into staying." The truth of her words hit him like a physical blow. He remembered the London merger clearly, the thrill of the chase, the intoxicating rush of power as he orchestrated the hostile takeover. He'd been brilliant, ruthless, acclaimed, and each victory had only fueled his hunger for more. "You never complained," he said quietly, realizing how weak it sounded, even as the words left his mouth. "Would you have listened if I had?" Grace picked up a piece of bread, breaking it slowly. And besides, that wasn't who I was, who I am. I don't believe in forcing people to see what they're determined to ignore. A moth fluttered near one of the candles, casting erratic shadows across the table. Theodore watched it dance with the flame, remembering summer nights when they'd sit out here for hours, talking about everything and nothing. "Do you remember Alessandro?" Grace asked, changing the subject with deliberate casualness. The name triggered an unexpected surge of emotion. "The Italian artist who wrote you all those letters about your work. You were jealous of him." A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "The only time you showed any interest in my gallery showings was when he was mentioned." "I wasn't." Theodore stopped, catching himself in the lie. "Yes, I was jealous. You had no reason to be. But you never asked about him, about any of it really. You just withdrew further into your work." Grace's voice held no accusation, only a quiet sadness. "That's when I knew I was losing you." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Theodore looked down at his plate, the food barely touched. He'd forgotten how good her cooking was, how she could turn simple ingredients into something that felt like home. "Tell me something, Theo," Grace said, leaning forward slightly. "Well, when was the last time you felt truly happy? Not successful, not accomplished, just happy?" The question caught him off guard. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. The answer should have been easy. He had everything he'd worked for, everything he thought he wanted. But sitting here, watching the candlelight play across Grace's face, he couldn't remember the last time he'd felt what she was asking about. "I thought so," she said softly, reading his silence. She stood, gathering their plates with the same care she'd always shown for their things. "There's dessert, if you'd like. I made your favorite, blackberry cobbler from the wild berries in the back." Theodore watched her walk toward the house, her figure silhouetted against the warm light spilling from the kitchen windows. She'd made his favorite dessert for their last dinner together. The realization made something inside him crack, just a little, like a hairline fracture in a foundation he'd thought was impenetrable. The moth finally flew too close to the flame, its wings singeing slightly before it spiraled away into the darkness. Theodore took a long drink of wine, trying to drown the uncomfortable feeling that he might be more like that moth than he cared to admit, drawn to a brilliant light, only to flee when it threatened to illuminate too much. The kitchen lights cast a warm glow over Grace as she served the blackberry cobbler, the fruit staining the porcelain dishes a deep purple. Theodore watched her movements, noting how at ease she seemed in this space, as if the intervening years had never happened. She'd rolled up her sleeves, revealing the small constellation of freckles on her forearms that he'd once known by heart. "I didn't expect you to remember," he said quietly, watching steam rise from the dessert. Grace paused, spoon hovering over his dish. "Remember what? The cobbler. That it was my favorite." He cleared his throat. "It's been years since you've had it." She finished serving and sat down at the kitchen island beside him. "Some things stay with us, Theo, like muscle memory. My hands still know how to make this just as they know how to hold a paintbrush." The first bite transported him instantly to Sunday mornings in this kitchen, Grace in his old Yale t-shirt, berries staining both their fingers as they baked together. The memory was so vivid it almost hurt. "You've been painting again," he observed, noticing the fresh smudges of color on her hands. "I never stopped." She took a small bite of cobbler, considering her next words. Would you like to see?" The question hung in the air between them. Theodore knew he should decline. Seeing her work had always made him feel things he couldn't control, couldn't categorize. But the wine had softened his edges, and the taste of childhood summers lingered on his tongue. "Yes," he heard himself say. Grace led him up the creaking stairs to her old studio, the space where she'd spent countless hours while he was building his empire. The room smelled of linseed oil and possibility, exactly as he remembered, but it wasn't empty as he'd expected. "You've been coming here," he realized, taking in the fresh canvases propped against walls, the recently used brushes soaking in jars, "every weekend for the past year." She moved to the windows, drawing back the heavy curtains to reveal the night sky. "While you were at the office, I was here, creating something new from what was left behind. Theodore's gaze swept across the room, catching on a series of paintings he'd never seen before. They were different from Grace's usual style, darker, more complex. Each canvas seemed to tell part of a story, emotions captured in swirling oils and bold acrylics. "This is us, isn't it?" he asked, stepping closer to one particular piece. It showed two figures, once intertwined, slowly separating like smoke in the wind. "It's my journey." Grace moved to stand beside him. "This was after the Chapman Foundation dinner, when you took that call during my speech. I came here and painted until sunrise." Theodore remembered that night, or rather, he remembered the deal he'd closed during that call. He'd forgotten it was during her speech, and this one, he gestured to another canvas, this one showing a woman emerging from a chrysalis of shattered glass. The day I stopped waiting for you to notice I was drowning." Grace touched the canvas gently. "The day I realized I had to save myself." Theodore felt something crack inside his carefully constructed facade. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I did, Theo. In every painting I tried to show you, in every conversation you were too busy for." She turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Art was never just a hobby for me. It was my voice, my truth. But you stopped looking, stopped listening." She moved to a covered canvas in the corner, her hands hesitating on the sheet covering it. "This is what I wanted you to see tonight. My last piece. Our last piece." With gentle movements, she unveiled the painting. Theodore felt the air leave his lungs. It was them, rendered in exquisite detail, dancing in this very house. But the painting was split down the middle. On one side, they were young, full of hope and love, their figures bathed in warm light. On the other, they were present day, separated by a growing darkness. Yet there was something else, something in the way Grace had painted the darkness itself. "It's not just shadow between us," he said slowly, understanding dawning. "It's a mirror." Grace nodded, "reflecting what we both chose to become. You see the beauty of the past, but also the truth of now, and the space between." She touched the canvas where the two times met. "That's where the real story lives." Theodore stepped closer, drawn to a detail in the mirror darkness. There, almost hidden, was a small light, like a star refusing to be extinguished. "What's that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Hope, maybe, or possibility." Grace's voice was equally soft. "Or maybe just the reminder that even in the darkest reflections, light finds a way to persist." Theodore stared at the painting, feeling the carefully constructed walls of his world begin to tremble. In Grace's art, he saw not just their story, but his own transformation, from the man who had danced with her in this house to the stranger who had forgotten how to see beauty in anything that couldn't be quantified. "I don't know how to look anymore," he admitted, the words scraping his throat. "I've forgotten how to see." Grace's hand found his in the darkness, a touch so familiar it made his heart stutter. "Then let me teach you again," she said. "One last time." The grandfather clock downstairs struck 10, its deep chimes echoing through the house. Theodore stood in the studio of the woman he'd stopped seeing, surrounded by the evidence of her pain and resilience, and felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Fear, not of failure or loss, but of what might happen if he finally allowed himself to truly see what he'd been running from all this time. "There's more," Grace said softly, releasing Theodore's hand. She moved to a stack of canvases leaning against the far wall, each one carefully wrapped in protective cloth. "I've been saving these. They tell our story, the parts you missed." Theodore's throat tightened as Grace began unveiling each painting, arranging them in a semicircle around them. The studio transformed into an intimate gallery, their life together displayed in chronological order, a timeline of love and loss, rendered in oil and emotion. The first painting stopped him cold. It showed their wedding day, but not the formal portrait that hung in their Manhattan apartment. This was a quiet moment Theodore had forgotten, him adjusting his cufflinks in the garden, unaware of being watched. a soft smile on his face that he barely recognized now. "You looked so young," Grace commented, studying his reaction. "So full of possibility." "I was terrified that day," he admitted, surprising himself. "Not of marrying you, but of not being enough." Grace's eyes met his. "You were always enough, Theo. That was never the problem." She moved to the next painting, a series of small scenes from their early years, Sunday morning coffee in bed. Theodore working late at the kitchen table, Grace sketching beside him, their first Christmas tree, more ornament than evergreen. Simple moments he dismissed as ordinary, now transformed through Grace's artistic vision into something precious. "Do you remember this?" She unveiled a larger piece, showing Theodore in his first corner office, surrounded by moving boxes and golden afternoon light. "My promotion to junior partner." He stepped closer, drawn to a detail in the background. Grace perched on his desk, champagne in hand, looking at him with such pride it made his chest ache. "You were so excited to show me the view," she said. "You kept pointing out all the buildings you'd help shape one day. Your dreams were beautiful then, Theo. They included me." The next painting made him physically step back. It showed a woman, Grace, curled up in their bed, moonlight streaming through the window. The loneliness radiated from the canvas in waves. "When was this?" he asked, though he already knew. "The night you missed our 5th anniversary." Grace's voice held no accusation, only a quiet sadness. "You were in Dubai. Your assistant sent flowers." Theodore remembered the deal he'd been closing, the millions at stake. He didn't remember sending the flowers. "I started coming here more after that," Grace continued, moving to a series of smaller works. Each showed the country house in different seasons, the garden growing wilder, more untamed. "It became my sanctuary, the place where I could still feel connected to the man I married." She paused at a particular piece, her fingers hovering over the surface as if she could touch the memory itself. The painting showed their kitchen, morning light streaming through the windows. 2 coffee cups sat on the counter, one full, one untouched. "I waited for you that Sunday," she said softly. "You promised you'd come, said we needed to talk. But there was an emergency board meeting." "Grace, No, let me finish." She turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I realized something that day, watching your coffee grow cold. I realized I'd become a lighthouse, Theo, standing still, shining faithfully, hoping to guide you home. But you weren't lost at sea. You'd chosen a different shore." The truth of her words hit him like a physical blow. Theodore looked around the studio, really seeing for the first time the story Grace had documented. Their love hadn't died in one dramatic moment. It had faded slowly, one missed coffee, one cancelled weekend, one forgotten anniversary at a time. "The last one," Grace said, moving to a canvas still covered. "I painted this yesterday." She pulled away the cloth to reveal a portrait of Theodore as he was now, impeccably dressed, successful, powerful. But Grace had painted him transparent, like glass, the city visible through his form, and in his chest, where his heart should be, was a tiny, locked room. "This is how I see you now," she whispered. "Beautiful, brilliant, but hollow. You've locked away so much of yourself, Theo. I don't think you even know where you've hidden the key." Theodore stared at his portrait, seeing himself through Grace's eyes. The successful man he'd worked so hard to become looked fragile, almost brittle, as if a single moment of real emotion might shatter him completely. "Do you know what the hardest part was?" Grace asked, her voice barely audible. "It wasn't the loneliness, or the missed moments, or even watching you choose your empire over our love. It was seeing you disappear, piece by piece, and knowing that you didn't even notice you were vanishing." Something broke inside Theodore then, a dam he hadn't even known existed. He reached out to touch the painted figure, his fingers trembling. "When did I become this?" "One choice at a time," Grace answered. "The same way you'll find your way back if you ever decide to try." The grandfather clock struck 11, its chimes echoing through the quiet house. Theodore stood surrounded by the gallery of lost moments, each canvas a testament to what he'd sacrificed at the altar of success, and for the first time in years, He felt the weight of every single choice that had led him here, standing before the evidence of his slow disappearance, painted by the woman who had loved him enough to document both his absence and her own survival. "And I don't know how to unlock it," he whispered, still staring at the tiny room in his painted heart. Grace picked up a paintbrush, rolling it between her fingers. "That's the thing about art, Theo. Sometimes we have to create what we can't find. Sometimes we have to paint our way back to ourselves." The old record player in the corner of the studio caught Theodore's eye, dusty but intact. Without thinking, he moved toward it, his fingers trailing along its familiar edges. How many nights had they spent here, Grace painting while vintage jazz filled the air? "It still works," Grace said, watching him. "I play it sometimes when I'm here alone." Theodore lifted the lid with careful hands, finding their old collection of vinyl still stored beneath. One record in particular made his hands pause, Ella Fitzgerald's "What Are You Doing the Rest of Your Life?", the song they danced to at their wedding. "Play it," Grace whispered, as if reading his thoughts. His hands trembled slightly as he placed the needle on the record. The first notes filled the room, crackling with age, but still haunting in their clarity. The sound seemed to physically shift the air in the studio, transforming the space into a pocket of suspended time. "Dance with me," Grace said, stepping forward. It wasn't a request born of romance or nostalgia, but something deeper, a challenge, perhaps, or a test. Theodore hesitated, his body remembering a time when such intimacy came naturally. "Grace, I don't think—" "Stop thinking," she interrupted. "That's all you do now. Think, calculate, measure, just feel. For one moment, Theo, let yourself feel." She held out her hand, and Theodore found himself taking it, muscle memory guiding them into position. Grace's other hand rested lightly on his shoulder, and he could feel the slight tremor in her fingers. They began to move, awkwardly at first, like actors trying to remember their parts in a long-forgotten play. Ella's voice wrapped around them, singing of futures and forever, of choices and chances. Theodore caught their reflection in the studio windows, two figures swaying in the dim light, surrounded by paintings that chronicled their unraveling. "Tell me something real," Grace murmured against his shoulder. "Not what you think I want to hear. Something true." The music swelled, and with it, something inside Theodore began to crack. "I'm scared," he whispered, the words escaping before he could stop them. Grace's hand tightened slightly in his. Of what?" "Everything. Nothing." He struggled to find the words, emotions he'd locked away for years, suddenly demanding voice. "Of being that young man in your paintings again. Of admitting that somewhere along the way I lost myself. Of—" his voice caught. "Of the fact that I don't know how to feel anything deeply anymore without feeling like I'm going to shatter." They turned slowly, their shadows merging and separating on the wall. "And when did it start?" Grace asked. "This numbness." Theodore closed his eyes, letting the music and the moment carry him back. "The Morrison deal," he said finally, "when I had to lay off 300 people to make the numbers work. I remember sitting in my office, signing the paperwork, knowing I was destroying lives. But all I could think about was how proud the board would be of my efficiency." Grace pulled back slightly to look at him, her eyes searching his face. "What did you do?" "I went to the bar that night, ordered the most expensive scotch they had, and told myself this was what success felt like." The memory tasted bitter now. "When I came home, you were asleep. There was a new painting by my side of the bed, a sunset over the city. You always knew when I needed beauty in my life, but I couldn't look at it, couldn't bear to see something so pure after what I'd done. So I started staying at the office later, taking more calls, booking more trips. It was easier than facing the way you saw me, the way I used to be." The song ended, but they kept swaying, caught in the gravity of the moment. In the silence between tracks, Theodore could hear both their hearts beating, slightly out of sync. "I have a confession," Grace said softly. "That night I wasn't asleep. I heard you come in, smelling of scotch and regret. I wanted so badly to reach out, to help you carry whatever burden you were bearing. But you had built your walls so high, even I couldn't find a way in anymore." Theodore felt something wet on his cheek and realized with surprise that he was crying. He couldn't remember the last time he'd allowed himself tears. "Oh, I thought I was protecting you," he said, his voice rough. "From the darkness of my world, from the hard choices, from what I was becoming. But I was really protecting myself, wasn't I? From your light, from your ability to see through every defense I built." Grace reached up, gently brushing away his tears with her thumb. The tenderness of the gesture undid him completely. Theodore's legs gave way, and he sank to his knees, still holding her hand, his body shaking with 7 years of suppressed emotion. "I'm sorry," he gasped, the words pouring out like a broken dam. "I'm so sorry, Grace, for every missed dinner, every forgotten anniversary, every time I chose emptiness over love, for becoming someone you couldn't recognize, for becoming someone I can't recognize." Grace knelt beside him, her own tears falling freely now. "Oh, Theo," she whispered, cradling his face in her hands. "I never stopped recognizing you. I saw you in every painting, every empty coffee cup, every silent morning. I saw you fighting to maintain those walls, to keep the world at bay. I saw you disappearing piece by piece, and it broke my heart, because I knew that somewhere inside that fortress you built, the man I loved was screaming to get out." The record had stopped playing, leaving only the sound of their shared grief filling the studio. Outside, a light rain began to fall, tapping against the windows like nature itself was weeping for what they'd lost. "Tell me it's not too late," Theodore whispered, looking up at the woman he'd pushed away for so long. "Tell me I haven't lost everything." Grace was quiet for a long moment, her hands still gentle on his face. "That's not for me to say anymore, Theo. The question isn't whether you've lost everything. The question is, now that you can feel again, what are you going to do about it?" The rain had grown stronger, drumming against the studio windows in sheets. Theodore sat on the old leather couch near Grace's easel, his tie loose, shirt wrinkled, every carefully maintained facade stripped away. Grace stood by her workstation, methodically cleaning her brushes, a ritual he'd watched 1,000 times before, but never truly appreciated. "I used to hate this sound," Theodore said quietly, listening to the rain. It meant delayed flights, rescheduled meetings, lost productivity. Grace dipped a brush in clear solvent, the blue paint clouding the liquid. "And now it sounds like permission," he said, surprising himself with the honesty. "Permission to be still, to remember." She set down her brush, turning to face him. "What do you remember?" Theodore closed his eyes, letting the rhythm of the rain guide his thoughts. "That morning in Paris, when we got caught in the downpour by the Seine, you were sketching the river, and I was checking emails on my phone. Then the sky opened up." A small smile touched his lips. "You grabbed my hand and pulled me under that little cafe awning. My phone got soaked, died completely." "You were furious," Grace recalled, but there was a warmth in her voice. "For about 5 minutes. Then you ordered us cognac and started drawing on the napkins, little cartoons of us, dripping wet and laughing." He opened his eyes, looking at her. "That was the last time I remember feeling completely present. No past to regret, no future to plan. Just there, with you." Grace moved to the windows, her silhouette dark against the rain-streaked glass. "We can't go back, Theo." "I know." The words felt like stones in his throat. "Even if we could, we're not those people anymore." She pressed her palm against the cool glass. "I'm not that woman who waited by the phone, who measured her worth by your presence. And you," she turned to look at him, "you're not the man who danced in the rain anymore. We've both changed." Theodore stood, moving to join her at the window. Their reflections overlapped in the glass, ghost-like and indistinct. "Tell me about your gallery," he said suddenly. Grace looked at him, surprised by the shift. "Oh, what?" "Your gallery, the one you're opening. I want to know about it." He met her eyes in the reflection. "Not because I'm trying to fix things, but because I should have asked years ago." A complex emotion crossed Grace's face. She was quiet for so long that Theodore thought she might not answer. Then, slowly, she began to speak. "It's in Providence. An old textile mill I'm renovating. 3 floors of space, with huge windows like these." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "The main gallery will feature emerging artists, people with raw talent but no connections, the kind of artists I was before I started believing in myself." "When did that happen?" Theodore asked softly. "When did you start believing?" Grace's reflection smiled, a mixture of sadness and pride. "Remember Alessandro, the Italian artist you were jealous of? He came to New York for a show 2 years ago. Found some of my work online and insisted on meeting. He spent 3 hours looking at my paintings, then told me something I'll never forget." She turned from the window to face Theodore directly. He said, "Your pain is beautiful, but your strength is magnificent." That was the first time anyone had seen past the sadness in my work to the power underneath. He offered to mentor me, introduce me to collectors, helped me understand that my art wasn't just therapy, it was my voice. Theodore felt the familiar sting of jealousy, but it was different now. Not possessive, but mournful. "I should have been that person for you." "No," Grace said firmly. "You needed to be my husband, my partner. I didn't need a mentor in you. I needed the man who once believed in magic and possibility. The man who saw beauty in small moments." She touched his arm gently. "The man who's standing here now, finally asking the right questions years too late." The rain began to ease, the drumming softening to a gentle patter. In the distance, thunder rumbled and moving away, taking the storm with it. "When does it open?" Theodore asked. "The gallery? 3 months." Grace moved back to her workstation, picking up her brushes again. "The renovation is almost finished. I'm living in a little apartment above it, watching it all come together." The image hit Theodore with unexpected force. Grace in a sun-filled apartment, surrounded by art and possibility, building something entirely her own. It was a future he hadn't been able to imagine for her, too caught up in his own narrow definition of success. "I'm proud of you," he said, the words feeling foreign but necessary on his tongue. "Not that you need my pride." "But I am." Grace's hands stilled on her brushes. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That means more than you might think." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, listening to the fading rain. Then Grace spoke again, her voice gentle but firm. "Theo, what are you going to do now? Not about us, about you, about that locked room in your heart." Theodore looked at her final painting, at his transparent self with its imprisoned heart. "I don't know," he admitted. "For the first time in my adult life, I don't have a 5-year plan or a strategic outlook. I just know I can't go back to being that hollow man in your painting." "Good," Grace said simply. "That's a start." She reached for a fresh canvas, setting it on her easel. Theodore watched as she selected a brush, mixed colors on her palette with practiced ease. Without asking, he knew she was about to paint this moment, this quiet aftermath of emotional storm, this space between what was and what would be. "Grace," he said softly, I'm sorry I stopped looking at your paintings. I think I was afraid of what I'd see in them, of what you'd see in me." She looked up from her palette, her eyes soft with understanding. "The funny thing about art, Theo, is that it shows us what we're ready to see. Maybe you're finally ready to look." The old grandfather clock struck midnight as they descended the stairs, its chimes echoing through the quiet house. Grace led the way, her bare feet silent on the wooden steps, while Theodore followed, his expensive shoes creating soft creaks that seemed to speak of his foreignness in this space he once called home. "I kept everything," Grace said, pausing at the bottom of the stairs. "Every room, exactly as it was. I thought about redecorating, making it completely mine, but—" She trailed off, her hand resting on the banister. "Some spaces hold too many stories to simply paint over." They moved through the darkened house, moonlight now streaming through windows where rain had fallen earlier. Each room they passed was a chapter in their shared history, preserved like exhibits in a museum of what they'd lost. The living room still held Theodore's leather armchair, positioned perfectly for reading, though a layer of dust suggested it had been years since anyone had occupied it. Beside it sat Grace's old easel, clearly well used, paintbrushes scattered around its base like fallen leaves. "You read to me here," Grace said softly, running her fingers along the arm of the chair. "That winter when the power went out for 3 days. You had that big merger coming up, but you couldn't access your emails, couldn't make calls, so you found that old collection of poetry. Frost," Theodore remembered, the memory surfacing like a long-lost photograph. "I complained the whole first day about lost productivity. Until you found me sketching by candlelight," Grace continued. "You said I looked like a figure from a Rembrandt painting. Then you picked up that book and started reading." Theodore moved closer to the chair, remembering, "Two roads diverged in a yellow wood," he quoted softly. "And that was the last poem you ever read to me?" Grace finished. Looking back, it seems almost prophetic, doesn't it? They moved to the kitchen next, where copper pots still hung above the island, catching moonlight like captured stars. Theodore's eyes were drawn to a small mark on the wall, about waist height. "The great pasta disaster of 2018, he said, touching the stain that no amount of cleaning had ever fully removed. Grace laughed, the sound bouncing off the tile walls. "You were so determined to cook for my birthday, said you'd been watching tutorials in your office during lunch. The sauce exploded everywhere," Theodore remembered, a smile tugging at his lips. "And all over my new suit, the walls, the ceiling somehow." "But you were laughing," Grace said, her voice soft with memory. "Really laughing, covered in marinara sauce, your tie ruined. That's when I started sketching you." Theodore turned to her, surprised. "You drew that moment?" Grace nodded, moving to a drawer near the sink. She pulled out a sketchbook, its pages worn with age and use. "I kept the quick ones here, the moments I wanted to capture before they slipped away." She opened to a page near the middle. There, in quick, confident strokes, was Theodore, as he had been that night, his usual corporate polish completely undone, joy written across his features as he surveyed the chaos he'd created. Theodore studied the sketch, searching for words. "Free," Grace supplied. "You look free." They continued through the house, each room offering its own memories, its own small heartbreaks. The dining room where they'd hosted Thanksgiving, the table still set for guests who would never arrive. The sunroom where Grace had nursed Theodore through a terrible flu. Her paintings abandoned for a week while she made soup and read him old mystery novels. Finally, they reached the music room. The baby grand piano sat in the corner, its black surface reflecting moonlight like water. This room, more than any other, held their deepest ghost. "We were going to teach her to play," Theodore said, his voice barely a whisper. Grace's hand moved unconsciously to her stomach, an echo of a loss 3 years past. "Charlotte," she said, speaking their daughter's name for the first time in years. "That we were going to name her Charlotte." Theodore approached the piano, lifting the lid with careful hands. The keys were dusty but intact, waiting for music that never came. "I'm sorry I wasn't here," he said, the words inadequate but necessary. "When you lost her, when you needed me most." "You were in Singapore," Grace said. No accusation in her voice, only stated fact. "The Anderson merger. I got on a plane as soon as I heard, but..." Theodore's fingers ghosted over the keys, not pressing down. "By the time I arrived, you'd already gone through it alone. And I didn't know how to handle your grief on top of my own, so I did what I always did. You buried yourself in work," Grace finished. "Started traveling more, staying later at the office. And you came here," Theodore realized, "to this house. To paint." Grace moved to the window, moonlight silvering her hair. "I painted her, Theo, over and over. The daughter we never got to meet, the life we never got to give her. But you never saw those paintings because you never came here anymore. Never asked why I disappeared every weekend." Theodore felt the weight of all his failures press down on him at once. "Show me," he said. "Show me our daughter through your eyes." Grace was still for a long moment, then nodded. She led him back upstairs, past her studio to a small room at the end of the hall, the room they'd planned as a nursery. Inside, canvases lined the walls, each one a different vision of what might have been. Charlotte playing the piano, her small hands dwarfed by the keys. Charlotte in the garden, chasing butterflies. Charlotte asleep in the window seat, a book open on her lap. And the most haunting, Charlotte as she might have looked at different ages, growing up in painting since she couldn't grow up in life. "This is how I survived," Grace said quietly. "By giving her the life we'd dreamed of, even if only in art. By being the mother I never got to be, with paint and canvas instead of flesh and blood." Theodore stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the family they'd lost. Not just Charlotte, but the people they might have been as parents, as partners, as lovers who faced tragedy together instead of apart. "We lost more than our daughter that day," he said, understanding finally reaching him. "We lost our way back to each other." Grace touched one of the paintings gently. "And maybe," she said, "or maybe we just took different roads in that yellow wood, and it's taken us this long to understand why." They ended up in the kitchen again, as people often do when emotions become too heavy to bear. Grace moved through the familiar space with quiet efficiency, pulling 2 mugs from the cabinet, the same mismatched pair they'd bought at a pottery fair their first summer in the house. Theodore watched as she prepared tea, her movements precise and practiced, like brushstrokes on canvas. "I kept your mug," she said, placing the blue ceramic piece in front of him. It was chipped on one side, a battle scar from some long-forgotten morning rush. Earl Grey, 1 sugar, no milk, unless that's changed too. Theodore wrapped his hands around the warm mug, anchoring himself in its familiarity. "No, that hasn't changed." They sat at the kitchen island, the space between them filled with the weight of Charlotte's room above them. The tea's steam rose in delicate spirals, catching the soft light from the range hood, the only illumination they'd bothered to turn on. "I used to imagine her here," Grace said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Saturday mornings, sitting right where you are now, feet swinging because she couldn't quite reach the floor. And drawing with my colored pencils while I made pancakes." Theodore closed his eyes, letting the image wash over him. "What color was her hair?" "Auburn, like yours. But she had my eyes." Grace took a sip of tea, her voice steady but quiet. "In my paintings, at least. I know it wasn't real, but artists are good at making dreams tangible. I never let myself imagine her," Theodore admitted, the words catching in his throat. "And it was easier to focus on things I could control, numbers, deals, growth projections." "Is that why you stopped coming to bed?" Grace asked. "Those months after, you'd work until dawn, sleep in your office." Theodore stared into his tea, watching his reflection fragment in the dark liquid. "Partly, but mostly. Mostly it was because when I did come home, I'd find you sleeping on her side of the bed. As if you were trying to fill an absence I couldn't even look at." Grace's hand trembled slightly as she set down her mug. "I didn't know you noticed that." "I noticed everything, Grace. I just didn't know how to respond to any of it. Every time I saw you curled up there, or found another one of her ultrasound photos in your sketchbook, or walked past that damn piano." He took a shaking breath. It felt like failing her all over again. "Failing you? You didn't fail her, Theo," Grace said softly. "What happened wasn't anyone's fault, wasn't it?" His voice was rough with emotion. "I was halfway around the world when you needed me most, when our daughter needed me most. Being there wouldn't have changed the outcome. No, but it would have changed everything else." Theodore pushed away from the island, needing to move. He paced the kitchen floor, his shoes clicking against the tile. "DT, do you know what I was doing when you called? I was celebrating. The merger had just gone through, and I was ordering champagne at some rooftop bar in Singapore. I didn't even check my phone for hours because I was so caught up in the victory." Grace watched him move, her artist's eyes tracking his agitation. "You never told me that." "How could I?" He stopped at the window, staring out into the night. Ah, how could I tell you that while you were living through our worst nightmare alone, I was toasting to my success, that by the time I finally listened to your messages, by the time I finally got on that plane, his voice broke. It was too late. Too late for Charlotte. Too late for us. The silence that followed was heavy with shared pain, with grief that had never been properly voiced. Then Grace stood, moving to join him at the window. Their reflections overlapped in the glass, creating a single, shadowed figure. "Look at me, Theo," she said quietly. He turned, forcing himself to meet her gaze. "I'm going to tell you something I've never told anyone," Grace continued. "That night, in the hospital, after they told me there was nothing they could do, I didn't call you first." Theodore felt his breath catch. "I called the house," she said. "This house. Let it ring and ring, knowing no one would answer, because some part of me thought if I could just hear the sound of our home, the place where we'd planned to raise her." She wiped away a tear with steady fingers. "I needed to hear that emptiness, to know it was real. That's when I knew I had to come back here, had to paint her, had to give her the life we'd dreamed of, even if only in art. But I took that from you too," Theodore said. "By staying away, by refusing to look at your paintings, by pretending we could just move on if we never spoke of her." Grace shook her head. "No, Theo, you didn't take anything. You lost her too, in your own way. We didn't know how to lose her together." She reached out, touching his face with gentle fingers. "You built towers and empires, trying to create something permanent in a world that had proven itself so fragile. I painted dreams and possibilities, trying to capture what might have been. We were both running from the same pain, just in opposite directions." Theodore leaned into her touch, allowing himself to feel the comfort he'd denied for so long. "I miss her," he whispered, speaking the words for the first time. "Our daughter, the family we should have been. The man I was before I learned that success couldn't protect us from loss." "I know," Grace said softly. "I've missed them too. All of them, including you." They stood there in the quiet kitchen, the tea growing cold behind them, while outside, the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. Not touching, except for Grace's hand on his cheek, but sharing the same breath, the same space, the same grief, finally, after all these years, mourning together instead of apart. The first blush of dawn painted the kitchen windows in pale gold, transforming their reflection into something almost ethereal. Grace moved away first, gathering their untouched tea mugs and placing them in the sink with quiet precision. "Come with me," she said softly. "There's something I need to show you." Theodore followed her through the house, up the stairs, past Charlotte's room of painted dreams, and into her studio once more. The morning light streamed through the large windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Grace moved to a corner where a large canvas stood covered, different from the others he'd seen earlier. "I finished this last week," she said, her hand resting on the cloth covering. "It's the last painting I'll do in this house." She pulled away the cover, revealing a triptych, 3 connected canvases that told a single story. Theodore felt his breath catch as he took it in. The first panel showed them as they were in the beginning, young, in love, full of dreams. Grace had captured the exact moment he'd proposed to her in this very house, down to the way the evening light had caught his mother's ring. The second panel was darker, showing their gradual separation, Theodore becoming transparent, Grace turning to her art, and between them, the ghostly figure of a small girl with auburn hair slowly fading away. But it was the third panel that made his heart stop. It showed them as they were now, separate but connected by golden threads of memory and loss. Behind each of them stood a version of Charlotte at different ages. Behind Theodore, a young woman in business attire, her father's ambition in her stance. Behind Grace, an artist with paint-stained hands and her mother's gentle eyes. And between them all, weaving the scenes together, was a pattern of cherry blossoms, the trees they'd planned to plant for Charlotte's first spring. "The Japanese have a concept called kintsugi," Grace explained, touching the golden threads that connected the panels, the art of repairing broken pottery with gold, making the breaks part of the piece's history rather than something to hide. I thought, maybe that's what we're doing now. Not fixing what's broken, but understanding how the breaking shaped us. Theodore moved closer to the painting, studying each detail. "You gave her our dreams," he said softly, seeing how each version of Charlotte carried pieces of the futures they'd imagined for her. "And my healing," Grace added. "This is the first time I've painted her as part of our story, not just as what we lost. She'll always be the dream that connected us, Theo. But maybe she doesn't have to be the reason we stop dreaming altogether." Theodore turned to Grace, seeing her in the morning light, strong, talented, whole in a way he was only beginning to understand. "The gallery in Providence," he said. "Will you show these, Charlotte's paintings?" Grace shook her head. "No, those are just for us, for the family we were, the parents we would have been. But this one," she gestured to the triptych, "this one I'll show, not because it's about loss, but because it's about transformation, about how love changes shape but doesn't disappear." "Like cherry blossoms," Theodore said, understanding flowing through him. "Beautiful not in spite of their impermanence, but because of it." Grace smiled, a genuine expression that reached her eyes. "Exactly. We spend so much time trying to build permanent things, empires, legacies, fortunes. But maybe the real beauty is in accepting that everything changes, that love can take new forms without diminishing what it once was." Theodore looked at the painting again, at the way Grace had captured their evolution with such honesty and grace. "I want to buy it," he said suddenly. Grace turned to him, surprised. "What?" "Not to keep it from being shown," he clarified quickly, "but to make sure it has a home after. It should be in your gallery, telling its story to anyone who needs to hear it. But when the exhibition ends," he met her eyes, "it should come back to this house." "You want to keep the house?" Grace asked carefully. "I want to keep what it represents," Theodore said. "Not as a place to live, we both know that time has passed, but as a sanctuary for what we were, what we lost, and what we might still become. A place where Charlotte exists in your paintings, where our memories have room to breathe." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "A place where you can still paint when you need to remember, and I can come when I need to learn how to see again." Grace was quiet for a long moment, considering. The morning light had grown stronger, filling the studio with clear, honest day. Finally she spoke. "On one condition." "Name it." "Plant the cherry trees," she said. "3 of them, in the garden where we planned to put her swing. Let them bloom each spring, marking time in their own way." Theodore felt tears prick at his eyes, but for the first time he didn't try to hold them back. "I will," he promised, "and I'll send you pictures when they flower so you can paint them if you want to." Grace reached out, squeezing his hand briefly before letting go. "Dawn's here," she said softly. "Our last night in this house is over." Theodore nodded, understanding that some endings were also beginnings in disguise. "Not our last visit, though." "No," Grace agreed, turning to look at the triptych one final time. "Not our last at all." Outside, the morning birds had begun their chorus, singing "Welcome to Another Day." Theodore watched as Grace began to gather her brushes, preparing to leave this space that had held so much of their story. She moved with the certainty of someone who knew exactly who she was and where she was going, not despite their shared pain, but because of how she'd learned to carry it. And for the first time since he'd walked into this house last evening, Theodore felt something close to peace. Not the empty calm of numbness he'd cultivated for so long, but something real and raw and honest, like the gold threads in Grace's painting, binding broken pieces into something new and unexpectedly beautiful. The morning sun had fully risen, filling every corner of the house with inescapable clarity. Theodore stood in the master bedroom, watching Grace methodically pack her painting supplies. She moved with practiced efficiency, each brush and tube finding its designated place in her worn leather satchel. "I never understood why you kept coming here to paint," he said, leaning against the doorframe. when we have had that perfectly good studio in the Manhattan apartment. Grace carefully wrapped a palette knife in soft cloth. The light's different here, she said. Cleaner somehow, less filtered through glass and steel. She paused, considering. But mostly I think I needed to paint in a place where I was once truly happy, where I could remember who I was before I became someone who needed to be saved. Theodore felt the weight of her words. And now I know I never needed saving. She closed her satchel with a decisive click. I just needed to remember how to save myself. They moved through the house together, preparing it for their departure. Grace opened windows to let in the morning breeze, while Theodore found himself straightening pictures on the walls, adjusting cushions, small gestures of care for a space that had held so much of their story. In the kitchen, Grace paused at the refrigerator, looking at something with a thoughtful expression. Theodore joined her, seeing what had caught her attention, a faded crayon drawing held by a magnetically attached frame. Lauren's artwork, Grace said softly, referring to their godchild, from the last time she visited, before everything changed, Theodore finished. The drawing showed 3 figures, clearly meant to be him, Grace, and Lauren, standing in front of what appeared to be this very house. Above them, drawn in a child's enthusiastic scrawl, were the words, "My favorite place." Grace carefully removed the frame from the refrigerator. "She asks about you, you know, when I see her at her dance recitals." Theodore felt a pang of guilt. "I've missed those too, haven't I?" "The last 3? Grace's voice held no judgment, only fact. "She's getting quite good. Has a solo in next month's showcase." Theodore watched as Grace wrapped the framed drawing in tissue paper, tucking it into her bag. "What did you tell her about us?" "The truth," Grace said simply. That sometimes people who love each other still need to find different paths, that it doesn't make the love any less real, just different." They moved to the living room, where morning light streamed through the large bay windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny stars. Grace's easel still stood in the corner, empty now, waiting for paintings that would never come. "I'd like to stay involved," Theodore said suddenly. "With Lauren's life, I mean, if you think that would be okay." Grace turned to him, her expression softening. "I think she'd like that. She kept your last birthday card, you know, the one where you wrote about teaching her chess someday." "I'd forgotten about that promise," Theodore admitted. "Maybe it's time to remember," Grace suggested gently. "Not all promises have to break with us." They stood in silence for a moment, letting the weight of possibilities settle between them. Then Grace moved to her old writing desk, pulling out a small envelope. "Speaking of promises," she said, handing it to Theodore, "the deed to the house. I've already signed my portion over to you." Theodore stared at the envelope, surprised. "Grace, no, this house should be yours. Your studio, your sanctuary." "It was," she interrupted softly, "for a long time, it was exactly what I needed. But now," she gestured to the space around them, "now I need to create something that's entirely my own, and you need a place to remember how to feel again." She smiled, a gentle, knowing expression. "Besides, someone needs to tend those cherry trees." Theodore felt tears threaten again, but these were different from the ones he'd shed earlier. These felt like release rather than regret. "I have something for you too," he said. Reaching into his jacket pocket, he pulled out a business card, offering it to her. "My personal number, not the office, not my assistant, just me." He took a breath. "For Lauren's recitals, or when the cherry trees bloom, or if you ever want to tell me about your gallery openings." Grace took the card, running her thumb over the embossed letters. "You've never given this number to anyone, have you?" "No," he admitted. "I always thought being unreachable made me more powerful somehow. Now I think maybe it just made me more alone." The morning had grown warmer, sunlight turning the hardwood floors to honey. Outside, birds called to each other in the garden, and somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower hummed, the ordinary sounds of a world continuing to turn. "We should go," Grace said softly. "I have a meeting with the gallery contractor at noon." Theodore nodded, but neither of them moved. They stood in the living room of their former home, surrounded by the ghosts of their past selves, their future selves, and the daughter who would forever exist in the space between. "I'll have my lawyer draw up the new deed," Theodore said finally, "and I'll call about the cherry trees this week." Grace shouldered her bag, picking up her satchel of art supplies. "Take care of this place, Theo," she said. "Not just the house, but what it represents. The memories, the dreams, even the pain, they're all part of our story now." "Our story," Theodore repeated softly. "Not ending, just changing shape." "Like cherry blossoms," Grace confirmed, echoing their earlier conversation. "Beautiful in their impermanence." She moved toward the door, her steps sure and steady. Theodore followed, carrying the weight of everything they'd discovered during their last night together, not in his shoulders as he had carried his burdens for so long, but in his heart, where perhaps they had belonged all along. They stood on the front porch, the morning sun warming the weathered wood beneath their feet. Grace's car was already packed, her art supplies carefully stowed in the trunk. Theodore's Bentley sat beside it, an embodiment of the different paths they were about to take. "Wait," Theodore said as Grace reached for her keys. He moved to his car, opening the trunk to retrieve something he'd brought from the city. "I want you to have this." He handed her a leather-bound portfolio, one she recognized from his office. Grace opened it carefully, her breath catching as she saw what was inside, every sketch she'd ever left on his desk, every doodle she'd made on meeting agendas, every small piece of art she'd tried to share with him over the years. "You kept them," she whispered, touching a drawing of the Manhattan skyline she'd sketched during one of their early dates. "In my desk drawer," Theodore admitted. "I couldn't look at them, but I couldn't throw them away either. They were evidence, I suppose, of who I used to be, of what we had." Grace lifted out a particular sketch, a quick study of Theodore sleeping in his office chair, his face peaceful in a way it rarely was awake. She'd drawn it late one night when she'd brought him dinner, back when such gestures still felt natural. "You looked so young," she said softly. "I was," he replied. "We both were." He gestured to the portfolio. "They belong with you now. In your gallery, maybe, or just wherever they might help tell your story." Grace closed the portfolio carefully, holding it against her chest. "Thank you," she said, and they both knew she meant for more than just the drawings. Theodore cleared his throat. "About the house, I was thinking, the garden room, the one that gets the best morning light. Yes, it should stay your studio whenever you want to use it, even after your gallery opens." He met her eyes steadily. "Some spaces should stay sacred," Grace nodded, understanding all he wasn't saying. "And Charlotte's room stays exactly as it is," he assured her. "Her story deserves to be preserved, even if only in paint and memory." The morning had grown warmer, heavy with the promise of another summer day. A butterfly danced through the garden, landing briefly on one of Grace's wild roses before continuing its journey. "I should go," Grace said, but she made no move toward her car. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small wrapped package. "This is for you. Don't open it until tonight." Theodore took the package, feeling its weight, something flat and square. "Grace, just promise me one thing," she interrupted gently. "Anything. When you look at it, really look. See what's there, not what you're afraid to find." She smiled, her expression both sad and hopeful. "You've remembered how to feel. Now it's time to remember how to see." Theodore nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared night settling around them like a familiar blanket. Finally, Grace stepped forward and did something that surprised them both. She hugged him. Not the formal embrace they'd shared at corporate functions, but something real and human. Theodore held her carefully, memorizing the feeling of this last moment of closeness. "Be happy, Theo," she whispered against his chest. "Not just successful, actually happy." When she pulled away, Theodore saw tears in her eyes, but her smile was genuine. She walked to her car with steady steps, her artist's bag and the portfolio of memories secure in her arms. "But Grace," Theodore called as she opened her car door. She turned, waiting. The gallery opening, 3 months from now. Yes? Send me an invitation. He managed a small smile. I'd like to see how your story continues. Grace's face softened with understanding. I will, and Theo, the cherry trees. I know, he said. I'll send pictures. Every spring. She nodded once, then got into her car. Theodore watched as she drove away, her car disappearing down the winding road that led back to the main highway. He stood there long after the sound of her engine had faded, holding her wrapped package and feeling the weight of possibility it represented. Finally, he turned to the house, their house, now his house, yet somehow always their home. The morning sun had risen fully, casting his shadow long across the porch. It reminded him of Grace's paintings, how she captured light and shadow, presence and absence, all in the same stroke. He walked inside, his footsteps echoing in the quiet space. But it wasn't the hollow emptiness he'd expected. Instead, the house felt full of memories, of art, of lessons learned too late, but perhaps not too late to matter. Theodore moved through the rooms slowly, seeing them with new eyes. In the kitchen, he touched the stain from their pasta disaster. In the music room, he ran his fingers along the piano keys, producing a soft, discordant chord. In Charlotte's room, he stood surrounded by her painted possibilities, no longer afraid to look at what might have been. Finally, he reached Grace's studio. No, their studio now, a shared space for remembering and creating. The morning light streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like stars. On the easel, Grace had left something, a blank canvas, perfectly primed and waiting. Theodore set her wrapped package on the workbench, knowing he would open it that night as promised. But for now, he simply stood in the light, letting himself feel everything. The pain and the joy, the loss and the hope, the ending and the beginning. Outside, a warm breeze stirred the garden, carrying the promise of summer. Soon cherry trees would grow where they had planned their daughter's swing. Soon new art would grace the walls of Grace's gallery. Soon life would carry them forward on their separate paths. But here, in this moment, Theodore Parker stood in the space between what was and what would be, finally understanding that some loves don't end. They just change shape, like light through stained glass, casting new and unexpected patterns on the walls of memory. The end. That was a beautiful story, wasn't it? I hope you enjoyed it. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your collaboration is very important to me.